I don't do reaction videos on my channel, though I have appeared, twice now, on the Weeb crew to do just that. The first time was to react to James Somerton's Utena video, and the second, as you will either have already seen or can guess, was to discuss Moon Channel's recent Kawaii, anime, propaganda, and soft power politics. These two videos could not be more different. One was a plagiarized mess about one of my favorite Japanese visual media properties by a disgraced professional YouTuber. The other was a masterful narrative examining the influence of soft power on anime fandom by an amateur YouTuber. An amateur YouTuber like me. The genesis of this video came about while I was compiling my notes and thoughts about Moon Channel's video for the Weeb Crew's stream, because I wanted to be as concise and coherent as possible when sharing my thoughts about a 2.5-hour long video. It was when I had gotten to around the 2,000 word mark and a script had started to cohere that a question began to form. What was the value in this? Why have I put aside the research for a video I was working on? Why did I force myself to watch 2.5 hours of a video I wouldn't have otherwise watched? Why am I going on the Weeb Crew to talk about this at all? Well, 2 reasons. One, they asked me, and they're good eggs. And the other, more topical reason, was that I think there is still potential in Anitube as a space for discourse, but only a particular kind of discourse. A friend of mine, Joe from the channel Pause and Select, once talked about how Anitube could not emerge as an academic space, but this doesn't preclude the possibility of the space as a vehicle for discourse, the informative, helpful, communicative, and critical exchange of ideas about the anime media form. Is it the best place for discourse? Well, no, frankly. It is indisputably better than AniTwitter, a cesspit of unending reaction and pain. I think the growing field of anime and manga studies remains the standard to shoot for, but like my friend Joe, and from everything I have been able to gather about Moon Channel, I too am not an academic. I'm just a guy who likes to do research as a hobby and make videos based on that research. And Anitube has been a community which, even if deeply fractured and disparate, has allowed me to reach an audience far greater than any I had previously had the opportunity to present to at anime conventions. So with all of that said, I'd like to try an experiment of sorts. What follows are my thoughts on Moon Channel's most recent video, a video whose central thesis and supporting arguments I strongly disagree with, for a number of reasons which will become clear. But this is not a reaction video, not a proper one anyway. Rather, I'm going to do my best to be thorough, fair, and above all, constructively critical. Think of this as Anitube peer review. Before I was asked by the Weeb Crew to come on their stream, I had never even heard of Moon Channel, let alone watched any of their videos. But now I have, and if nothing else, can recognize someone who is passionate and, importantly, skilled at their craft, the craft of making video essays. And while it is worth pointing out that this is also the first video on the channel which has dealt specifically with anime, so that I may be being a touch flexible in my definition of Anitube here, well, borders are often nebulous and discourse happens erratically. I believe Anitube has the potential to develop into a discursive space, a space where through community participation, discussion, and refinement, agreed upon definitions and understandings of shared terminologies centered on discourse around anime as a media form can emerge, in the process creating an informed but ultimately amateur source of information which the wider anime fandom can use to critically engage with the media they love. And so, I hope my critique fosters a sense of critical reflection for the potential of Anitube to be something more than it currently is. To, perhaps, develop into a space which leverages its strength in disseminating informed perspectives on anime in an engaging and entertaining way to a mass audience, while facilitating rigorous examination and thorough use of reliable sources of information which can result in the exchange of ideas among Anitube creators themselves beyond the existing ecology of reaction content. Wish me luck.
If, when I start talking about Japanese culture, your mind goes to cherry blossoms in Kyoto, consumer electronics, or growing up with Dragon Ball Z, or Sailor Moon, or Saint Seiya, or Hello Kitty, or for that matter, Kiki's Delivery Service, If you picture Harajuku or cosplayers or Hatsune Miku or Pokemon or any number of cute, consumable Japanese products, then congratulations. You are not immune to propaganda.
To start with, I think Moon Channel's introduction is a problem, because the idea that anyone who becomes familiar with a foreign culture through images rather than direct experience or within the confines of an academic setting are being propagandized to forecloses the possibility of transcultural flows. Transcultural flow is a concept I became familiar with through the work of Sandra Annett, particularly her work Anime Fan Communities, Transcultural Flows and Frictions. Annett problematizes the idea of transnational, owing to the instability of national identity in the face of 40 years of globalization, and instead uses the concept of the transcultural thusly. Transnational, or as I will shift to calling it transcultural, media globalization is not just a trading of text between powerful nations. It does not develop whenever we influence them or vice versa. It is a movement of media and bodies that takes place across multiple sites. To watch a televised anime program such as Voltron Defenders of the Universe in Canada in the 1980s, as I did in my childhood, required much more than the twin poles of Japan as the source and Canada as the reception site, but entailed mediation through the multi-city relays of American cable television broadcasting and the labor of South Korean animators. Annett, writing in 2014, positions herself between what she characterizes as polemical voices of soft power and utopian voices of resistance. This book, however, acts as an intervention into the polarized discourses on media globalization, which frame animation as either the neo-imperial domination of Disneyfication or as a wellspring of active resistant readings. It argues that anime fans around the world are neither dupes of corporate mass marketing and nationalist soft power initiatives, nor radically empowered techno-activists forming utopian global villages. Rather than focusing on top-down oppression or bottom-up resistance, Anime Fan Communities demonstrates that it is in the productive frictions or the multiple intersections and collusions between different uses of media texts at corporate and interpersonal levels that transcultural fan communities are born. Moon Channel's video, then, clearly falls into the earlier category of understanding a media form like anime and the transcultural nature of its production, promulgation, and popularity, as he overtly describes all mediated cultural projection as propaganda. Funnily enough, something he touches on toward the end of the video, what has been called the crisis of area studies, has itself been fostered by the increasing instability of national borders and cultivated national identity in the face of an already globalized cultural milieu. The further difficulty, then, is that if all media produced in a country outside one's own is necessarily defined as propaganda, then the idea of anime being uniquely problematic, or the efforts of the Japanese state being particularly effective, becomes a banal observation, robbing the label of propaganda of any kind of analytic utility and rhetorical power. And we'll look at some examples of propaganda in a little bit, but for now it is important to keep this in mind, because this understanding of propaganda frames the rest of the video and will at times result in contradictions and walkbacks, albeit weak ones.
Japan wants to sell its goods and bolster its policy positions and cement its trade advantages, but it has no military to do so. It needs to propagandize.
So the related problem here is a very broad use of the term soft power with a very specific connotation, the aforementioned propaganda. Joseph Nye's definition is as follows. This soft power, getting others to want the outcomes that you want, co-opts people rather than coerces them. Soft power rests on the ability to shape the preferences of others. Interestingly enough, Nye wrote an op-ed in the January 10, 2003 edition of the New York Times titled Soft Power, Propaganda Isn't the Way, a year before he would go on to publish his seminal text, Soft Power, which distinguishes between propaganda and soft power. Attraction depends on credibility, something a Pentagon propaganda campaign would clearly lack. On the contrary, by arousing broad suspicions about the credibility of what the American government says, such a program would squander soft power. Nye's spectrum for the operation of power slides from the ability of hard power to coerce on one end to the ability of soft to co-opt on the other. It is through this co-opting that soft power operates. What does co-optive power entail? Co-optive power, the ability to shape what others want, can rest on the attractiveness of one's culture and values, or the ability to manipulate the agenda of political choices in a manner that makes others fail to express some preference because they seem to be too unrealistic. Where my criticism stems from, in part, is that Moon Channel's definition of soft power is both overly broad while simultaneously being too restricted. Nye talks at length about the significance of culture in shaping soft power, but he mentions that culture is just one prong of a greater whole. The soft power of a country rests primarily on three resources: its culture, in places where it is attractive to others; its political values, when it lives up to them at home and abroad; and its foreign policies, when they are seen as legitimate and having moral authority. These other prongs, especially the political values of the Japanese state, aren't something which anime is particularly adept at promoting, let alone the state itself. Something I'll touch on later is the flattened image of Japan that Moon Channel believes anime cultivates outside of Japan, while ignoring alternate, largely foreign media-generated images like Wacky Japan, a newer manifestation of Orientalism, an image which is carried by certain attitudes towards Japanese visual media like anime. According to the late Mark McLelland in his article, Acute Confusion, the Unpredictable Journey of Japanese Popular Culture, analysts have not been able to articulate precisely what values Japan is supposed to be communicating via its global trade in cute artifacts. Prime Minister Aso's comment seems to suggest the relatively straightforward transfer of the warm and fuzzy feelings generated by Japanese cute products onto Japan, the nation state. But what, exactly, does cuteness signify here, other than a sense of harmlessness? With that said, is it wrong when Moon Channel examines anime and Japanese pop cultural products more broadly as an example of soft power? No, I don't think so at all. But if the scholar who coined the term soft power differentiates it from propaganda, then maybe it would be worth considering that propaganda needs to have more specificity than mediated image or speech, which seeks to communicate a message to convince you of something. In fact, Nye addresses what I think would be a fair characterization of Moon Channel's central thesis. Some analysts treat soft power simply as popular cultural power. They make the mistake of equating soft power behavior with the cultural resources that sometimes help produce it. They confuse the cultural resources with the behavior of attraction. Now, I'm not sure how much of Nye's text Moon Channel read. He doesn't list it among his sources, so perhaps it was enough to simply credit Nye with establishing the concept and move on. Since I have no idea, I can only make inferences, and since Nye also delineates between soft power and propaganda in his book, it is odd then that Moon Channel seemingly uses them interchangeably. Nye tends to relegate propaganda as media or mediated efforts, which are direct missives from the state to the public, and characterizes it as being an effect of more traditional hard power methods, the hard sell, something which might see initial success, but can just as easily damage state credibility, as in the case of America claiming that Iraq had WMDs. Nye characterizes soft power as, among other things, the realization of milieu goals. It has a crucial role to play in promoting democracy, human rights, and open markets. He also notes that it is true that firms, universities, foundations, churches, and other non-governmental groups develop soft power of their own that may reinforce or be at odds with official foreign policy goals. That is all the more reason for governments to make sure that their own actions and policies reinforce rather than undercut their soft power. And this is particularly true since private sources of soft power are likely to become increasingly important in the global information age. While Nye does talk about the central role that non-state actors have in the promotion of soft power, he also notes that the hallmark of the state utilization of soft power is to create environments in foreign nations favorable to the goals of the domestic state. This aspect is something which I do think Moon Channel manages to convey quite well. The problem is that he uses this understanding of the function of soft power to make some declarative but ultimately unsubstantiated claims. We'll get to those in a bit. One of the limitations of Nye's text, on the other hand, is that globalization has kept a pace since 2004, and what were already becoming murky and permeable boundaries at the turn of the millennium have only become less stable 20 years on. And so, while I do agree that anime is a form of soft power, the implications and feasibility of it to achieve the policy goals of the Japanese state are greatly exaggerated in this video. Let's turn now to examine the evidence that Moon Channel uses to construct his arguments.
And there just so happens to be an entire industry in Japan that was built for propaganda. It's full of artists who grew up with and were inspired by said propaganda.
One of Moon Channel's central claims is that the consolidation of the pre-war Japanese animation industry at the behest of the imperial government, all the better to produce wartime propaganda, is also the genesis of the post-war anime industry. This is an incredible oversimplification, which is not helped by the fact that his source for this is from Yamaguchi Katsunori's, and it needs to be said, Watanabe Yasuhi's Nihon Animation Eiga Sha, or The History of Japanese Animation. There are two issues with this text in particular. One is that it has not been translated into English, and so it is an odd choice for a source used in a video for an ostensibly English-speaking audience. Maybe it's a flex on Moon Channel's part to demonstrate he can read Japanese. The other, and more critical issue, is that the text was published in 1977. While the age of a text does not necessarily impugn the information it provides, it is nevertheless odd to rely on a text published almost 50 years ago, especially when more recent texts like Jonathan Clements' 2013 Anime A History, an author Moon Channel cites in his video, or Maria Roberta Novelli's 2018 Floating Worlds, A Short History of Japanese Animation, or even Japanese texts like Yamaguchi Yasuo's 2004 text, Nippon no Anime Zenshi, The Complete History of Japanese Animation. Maybe it's just as simple as having the text at hand, or having previously read it and being familiar with it and liking it. I can only guess. But still, if the conclusions which Moon Channel arrived at for the origins and particularly contemporary state of the anime industry as being one of continuity from the Showa to the Reiwa were the result of this text, then it demonstrates the pitfalls that relying on a single text can have. Surely something that will not be important later. As I do not have access to this text, and even if I did, I can't read Japanese, I can only speculate to its contents. However, as it is one of many texts included in the bibliography of Clements' Anime A History, a source it needs to be said he cites several times throughout, I am not disputing its accuracy nor its utility. But what Clements' text also demonstrates is that the benefit of newer options is that you will still have access to the older ones, with the benefit of contemporary developments and historiography. Moon Channel first discusses Momotaro's Divine Sea Warriors, which he refers to as Sacred Sailors, in the section Pure or Peril, and will continually refer to it because it's one of the primary linchpins of his narrative.
To that end, the first ever animated feature-length film produced in Japan, the first anime film, was Momotaro's Sacred Sailors, released in 1945.
Because it is the first full-length animated film in Japan, and as it is a very clear example of a propaganda film, he can do a lot of rhetorical heavy lifting with it. It is understandable that the film had a significant impact on the Japanese animation industry. Jonathan Clement notes that according to Nobuyuki Sugada, that of around 100 animators in Tokyo in 1946, 50 to 75 of them worked on Momotaro's Divine Sea Warriors in some capacity. Moon Channel also emphasizes the fact that Osamu Tezuka was deeply impacted by the film, so much so that he was brought to tears and would later pay homage to the film in an episode of Jungle Emperor Leo.
Fun fact before we move on, if you're an anime buff, you might have noticed that the scene I showed you while talking about Momotaro Sacred Sailors seems awfully familiar. Well, that's because Osamu Tezuka, the creator of Kimba the White Lion, was so deeply moved by Momotaro that it allegedly brought him to tears, and so he included an homage in Kimba the White Lion, where Kimba teaches primitive jungle animals to speak Japanese.
Moon Channel picks up this connection in the Organic Origins of Anime section, where at around 1 hour, 10 minutes, and 54 seconds, he talks about Toei trying to recruit the veteran animator Tadahiro Mochinaga to help produce animation for TV.
But Toei was not to be deterred, and they attempted to bring the former assistant director of Momotaro Sacred Soldiers, Mochinaga Tadahito, on board to spearhead this cartoonish endeavor. Tadahito rejected the offer, leaving Toei apparently out of options. It was then that highly regarded manga creator Tezuka Osamu arrived on the scene.
This is important because he identifies Mochinaga as the assistant director for Momotaro's Sacred Soldiers. He misspoke. He meant sailors. It happens. When Mochinaga turns it down, the company approached Osamu Tezuka. A rhetorical torch is passed, and the rest is history. But there's a problem. Several, actually. For starters, Mochinaga wasn't involved in the production of Momotaro's Divine Sea Warriors. The director of the film, Seo Mitsuyo, who did work with Mochinaga on the earlier Momotaro's Sea Eagles, had left Geijotsu Eigasha, the company which produced the earlier film, to work for Sochiku Doga Kenkyosho on the Divine Sea Warriors film. Mochinaga, instead, was offered the job of directing Fukuchan no Suisenkan, Fukuchan's Submarine, which would be released in 1944. Next, it is worth pointing out that in terms of propaganda, the earlier Sea Eagles was far more successful than the later Divine Sea Warriors, as Clements notes. Instead, it was the 1943 Momotaro Sea Eagles that was the defining Japanese propaganda cartoon of the war era. It was the keystone achievement of Japanese animation in the war period, and with takings more than 3 times higher than its production budget, a remarkable success compared to the fortunes of the Disney studio during the same period, when its features were running up huge debts. While Divine Sea Warriors is recognized as a technical achievement as the first full-length animated film, its release was stymied by being released in 1945, when much of the infrastructure of most major Japanese cities had been bombed into rubble. Following the war, copies of the film reels were confiscated and destroyed, and the film would not see a wide Japanese release until a negative was rediscovered in 1983. In fact, only someone from a relatively affluent family who perhaps had their own projector and screening room would have been privy to the film at the time of its release, someone like Osamu Tezuka. Now, whether Moon Channel described Mochinaga as a notorious propagandist is a joke, or in sincerity, I'm not sure. And while it is undeniable that he did help in the creation of the seminal propaganda cartoon of the war, this belies the historic conditions and personal experiences of animators like Mochinaga. Characterizing the staff who worked on these films as ultranationalist ideologues or even especially patriotic Japanese citizens is fraud. Despite the fact that these companies had been contracted by the Naval Ministry, production issues, lack of resources, and even continual drafting efforts dogged these productions at every turn. Despite the willingness of the Navy Ministry to fund the film, Momotaro Sea Eagles, amounting to an eventual cost of 200,000 yen, staffing levels were still critically low. The company, Geijutsu Eigasha, GES, was offering low pay rates and animators were rare, so that Seo and Mochinaga eventually created much of the animation on their own. In fact, during the production of Mochinaga's later film, He was called up for active duty and only avoided it through the direct intervention of the Naval Office. This was an incredibly rare occurrence, as animators, as part of the film industry, were regarded with suspicion and were even dogged by accusations of cowardice throughout the war. Draft dodgers who avoided conscription, choosing to make animation instead of shooting at American soldiers. In his own memoirs, Mochinaga expressed remorse and a sense of guilt for having helped on the war effort. I heard that many youths volunteered for the Flying Corps, and that while they were on duty, they died on air raids. I wonder whether the film we made influenced their decision to volunteer. I thought, in the future, I only wish to make a film that would benefit the young, difficult though that may be. Now, taking all of this into account, and perhaps tempering it with the understanding that animators at Disney were also producing propaganda films featuring Donald Duck sinking Japanese warships, I think it is fair to say that Moon Channel's presentation of the film is overly simplistic while lacking necessary historic context to demonstrate its impact as wartime propaganda. This is because Momotaro's Divine Sea Warriors is presented as the foundation of the post-war Japanese animation industry, necessarily tainting all works which came after. At least, this is the thread which will run through the rest of the video, tying a number of animators, studios, and media properties together, and will come to rest on the next property I'd like to talk about.
A fantasy anime in which the hero of the story is literally the Japanese military.
If Momotaro's Divine Sea Warriors is presented as the crown jewel of the Japanese state producing animation as propaganda, then the media franchise which Moon Channel uses to exemplify the through line to contemporary anime production is Gate. The anime adaptation of Gate was released in 2013, and it is unequivocally, unabashedly, unmistakably pro-Japanese self-defense force. Moon Channel characterizes the series thusly.
Produced, designed, and funded in coordination with the JSDF, writes Dr. Brummer, the fantasy-based series glorifies Japan's defense establishment with a doe-eyed cast of capable, identifiable, and non-threatening characters that protect Japan from alien invaders.
Now, Moon Channel's source for this statement is an article, Japan, the Manga Military, that was published in The Diplomat by international relations scholar Matthew Brummer. It is an interesting article which raises some alarms about the LDP using anime and manga to further its pro-remilitarization efforts by appealing to foreign audiences. Brummer makes a compelling case, and, as I can only speculate, may have been the reason that Moon Channel presented Gate as his singular example of a contemporary anime production which demonstrates his thesis. After all, it would be difficult to top an anime production produced, designed, and funded in coordination with the JSDF. There's just one problem. Brummer was wrong. The Diplomat is not a peer-reviewed academic journal, and as such, its standards for sourcing claims is left up to the writer. As I mentioned, Brummer is a respected and published academic, and while he has written an interesting article, critically, he does not provide a source for his claims about the production of Gate. This is where additional research would have benefited the video, because sometimes a source can be too good to be true. So where did Brummer get this idea? One possibility is that in the credits of the Gate anime itself, a number of JSDF agencies are listed under the heading of collaborative cooperation, and when coupled with the blatant pro-JSDF narrative, that seems pretty definitive, right? Well, as it turns out, a lot less than you might think given Brummer's declarative statement. Some of the staff on the production were allowed to conduct interviews with JSDF staff and tour a base, and the Tokyo Regional Cooperation Headquarters was allowed to produce recruitment poster featuring Gate artwork. Not exactly the smoking gun collaboration with the JSDF is presented as, and there are worse implications in the video. For example, in the same section where Gate is discussed, Moon Channel brings up Michael Bay's Transformers to make what is ultimately a false equivalence between the anime industry and Hollywood. You see, the US military has direct editorial control over the productions it collaborates with, including, among other things, script reviews, on-shoot consultants, and final approval by the Pentagon. Now, I've mentioned that Brummer doesn't provide evidence for the claims about the collaboration between the JSDF and Gate, so let's look at someone who has. The scholar Takayoshi Yamamura, on the other hand, has published a comprehensive study of the interactions of the JSDF with anime productions from 1980 to 2017, and also happens to discuss Gate at length. Yanai, the creator of Gate, originally published it as a web novel from 2006 to 2009 on the Arcadia website, which was eventually adopted into a manga in 2011 and then finally into an anime in 2015. It was only after the anime had been made that the original author approached a local branch of the JSDF to propose a collaboration with them. As Yamamura notes in his study, the JSDF occupies a passive role and waits for productions to approach them to propose collaboration, but have recently been more receptive and enthusiastic about such collaborations. The other place where you can find information about anime productions is through websites like the Anime News Network's Encyclopedia, where you can find staff listings and, importantly, what companies were involved in the production. Gate, as it happens, had 5. Alpha Polis, Bandai Namco Entertainment, Genco, Showgate, the Clockwork Company Limited, and Warner Brothers. The JSDF, you will note, is not listed anywhere, which again would be odd if they were the ones who proposed, funded, and produced the anime. As I mentioned, it is undeniable that Gate is pro-JSDF, but the reason for that isn't because they were involved in the production, but because Yanai himself was once a member of the JSDF and remained an enthusiastic supporter. Something, it needs to be said, was not mentioned in Brummer's article. So, if the metric for propaganda is state-backed and directed anime, Gate does not clear that threshold. In a similar fashion, Gate also fails as an example of anime being used as an expression of soft power, because all of the marketing material produced in collaboration with the JSDF was for a domestic audience, something which is clearly shown in Moon Channel's video. You can't help but notice that the promotional materials is all in Japanese. The reason the JSDF collaborated with the Gate production was to leverage the popularity of a pro-JSDF series in their own recruitment efforts, not to appeal to foreign governments or anime fans. In the face of this, what else does Moon Channel have to offer as an example of contemporary anime being used as propaganda to accumulate soft power? He gestures at the potential for pro-fascist readings of Attack on Titan, but doesn't talk about its production. Spoilers, no JSDF there either. Towards the end of the video, he also hints that because the Young Animators Training Project received funding from the Agency for Cultural Affairs, that Little Witch Academia might have also been compromised. But that's about it. Suffice it to say that the evidence Moon Channel presents to demonstrate the Japanese state using anime as propaganda is non-existent, as his singular example of Gate collapses under the weight of basic research. And here is a cautionary tale for aspiring video creators. Don't construct your video around a single example, based on a single source, without confirming the validity of the claims being made. Have more than one example, and vet it through cross-referencing and fact-checking multiple sources. So if anime isn't being produced as propaganda at the behest of the Japanese state, then why is the Cool Japan Fund nevertheless promoting it?
Programs like Cool Japan and central government support for the proliferation of anime and manga and video games and J-pop sought to push this image of Japan as being not like us, but different from us. Better than us, even. As exotic, as interesting, as cool.
By most accounts, the failure of the LDP's Cool Japan strategy, which officially began in 2010, followed up with the establishment of the Cool Japan Fund in 2013, was already apparent by 2017, when many of the ventures the fund invested in had failed. 4 years after its launch, its taxpayer-funded projects are failing to meet expectations, proving the critics right in their view that the Cool Japan project is out of touch with what the international market really wants. The Cool Japan Fund has agreed to invest about 50 billion yen spread out over 24 projects. Internal documents and other evidence show that at least 10 of the 18 investments decided on at least a year ago have failed to reach their goals. Owing to the continued failure of the fund, it had to be restructured in 2021 and, as of 2023, was sitting at a loss of 30.9 billion yen, around $218 million, with many critics of the fund calling for it to be cancelled altogether. Now, to his credit, Moon Channel mentions these failings, but makes the case that the LDP doesn't care that the fund has failed because they have their agenda to push and so will still pump money into the fund and, if necessary, further consolidate by increasing government oversight, which he characterizes like this.
Quoting now an article from Nikkei Asia titled Government Weighs Fate of Floundering Cool Japan Fund. The fund plans to come up with a plan to improve financial returns by autumn, including strengthening oversight of the companies in which the fund has invested. However, if the effort fails, the article here quoting from a report from the Finance Ministry's Subcommittee on Fiscal System Council, will organize a path forward with a view to consolidation. End quote. Pay attention to that language, strengthening oversight of the companies invested. As you will recall, that's basically every major media company in Japan. The answer was to exercise even greater control, more oversight, to consolidate and centralize the cultural industry even further under the auspices of the Japanese government.
So the implication is that the Japanese state will exert even more control over the fund, and this will mean that they will have more control over the anime that is produced and released outside Japan. The problem is that there's nothing to support this assertion. His anime examples were not produced as propaganda. Moon Channel has also not demonstrated any evidence of organizations like the Cool Japan Fund or JLOP exerting influence on distribution and localization, which makes sense when you consider that, according to Christine Santos and Fabriani Xianbing in their chapter in the seminal text End of Cool Japan, while JLOP provides opportunities for overseas companies to introduce Japanese media to a local market, it does not oversee how these media are translated or localized. Likewise, JLOP has no control over how these localized Japanese media are subsequently consumed by foreign audiences. Accordingly, these media are transformed in the hands of their foreign localizers and authorities who determine the local meanings of these Japanese texts. This also relates back to Moon Channel's tendency to flatten not only Japan, but the Japanese state as well, because it is not the opposition which is critiquing the fund, but it was the Finance Ministry which was considering merging it or scrapping it altogether. Furthermore, Moon Channel repeats throughout the video that the current state of the Japanese animation industry is one which is organized in a state-led, top-down effort to establish what is cool.
This office focused on everything from anime to video games to cuisine to J-pop. The definition of cool started to flow from the top down. The quirky fashion you loved, the kawaii musical pop star, much of it, arguably all of it, was coordinated and often even funded in a top-down fashion.
But as noted by Santos and Xianbing, John Fisk has argued that popular culture is formed always in reaction to and never as a part of the forces of domination. Hence, regardless of any sense of Japaneseness that the Japanese government may hope attaches to anime and manga in order to become popular culture texts, any intended meanings are poached, redefined, or reimagined by audiences in order to make these texts more meaningful to their lives. A major issue with how Moon Channel has framed the supposed influence that the Cool Japan Fund, and through them the LDP, have on the production and distribution of anime is that he doesn't demonstrate that he knows how contemporary anime is produced. He makes a totally unsubstantiated declaration that the anime industry has been designed to produce propaganda since the 1940s, and then just assumes that this is how it still operates.
Now look, let me be clear, I'm not saying that all of these subsidies from these programs were made for propaganda purposes. nor am I suggesting that every anime localized by Sentai Holdings was for propaganda. But I am saying that the Japanese government intentionally utilized subsidies to reorient their cultural industry to align with their desired political narratives, and did so especially in the animation industry, an industry with roots in the production of government propaganda to begin with. That while not all of the anime you watched was subsidized by and co-opted for the Japanese government, some of it absolutely was, for purposes that are almost completely opaque.
This, once again, may be owing to the fact that his single source for the development of the animation industry in Japan is a book published in 1977, but this is again speculation on my part. I touched on it when discussing Gate, but since the late 1990s and early 2000s, the primary means of getting an anime made have relied on the development of the production committee system, as explained by Mark Steinberg. The committee system sees a number of companies temporarily band together for the aim of producing a particular film, animation series, or media mix, with each company contributing capital and/or resources to the project. One of the hallmarks of the production committee model is that authority is dispersed among the committee members, each representing the interests of their respective companies, something Steinberg characterizes as being, for better or worse, with a distributed decision-making system that prevents complete control from being exerted by any single member. So even if there was an example of a government office being directly involved on an anime production, their voice would be one among many interests. But the failure of Cool Japan is not only attributable to the mismanagement of funds and poor investment decisions, but also because of a lack of tangible policy which benefited the diplomatic efforts of the Japanese state. To exemplify the practical impact of Cool Japan, Moon Channel discusses the ongoing discourse around comfort women, and particularly memorials which have been erected in various jurisdictions to the victims of the Imperial Japanese state who were forced into prostitution during the Asia-Pacific War. He centers his argument on the year 2018 and discusses an incident involving Mitsuhiko Fuji, a Japanese diplomat who was recorded kicking a memorial set up in Taiwan.
In 2018, a visiting Japanese diplomat, one Mitsuhiko Fuji, went out of his way to kick a bronze statue memorializing comfort women in Taiwan. He claimed he was merely stretching his legs and that everyone was blowing the situation out of proportion.
The problem is that Fuji is not, and was not at the time, a diplomat, nor was he acting in any capacity as a representative of the Japanese state. Fuji was part of a delegation of the Alliance for Truth About Comfort Women, a collective of revisionist, ultranationalist, and right-wing organizations who reject the historical consensus on comfort women, and was visiting Taiwan to meet with a local city councilor to talk about the statue and the issue of comfort women more broadly. Moon Channel's source for this is a 2018 BuzzFeed News article written by William Yang. Yang does not refer to Fuji as a diplomat, but the confusion may have arisen as later on in the article, Yang talks about the protests which occurred outside the Japanese representative office, the de facto Japanese embassy, wherein a representative received the group's letters of protest. It is also worth noting that following this incident, Fuji stepped down from his position in the Alliance, and the Alliance itself issued an apology, something Moon Channel's own video displays. Now look, the Alliance issued the apology because it was caught on camera and undeniably looks bad, but they're still ideologues committed to the refutation of comfort women, so take their apology for what it's worth. What is evident is that Moon Channel has demonstrated that he is not a careful reader, and because of this makes misleading assertions which are not supported by his sources. The issue of comfort women is one which is fraught within Japan. Moon Channel is quite correct when he notes the LDP have been notoriously backhanded on the issue, going so far as to distance the state from the first apology on the subject issued in 1992 by then Prime Minister Miyazawa, who issued an apology while visiting South Korea. The official position of the Japanese state on comfort women is characterized as one of public acknowledgement and private compensation through the Asian Women's Fund, an effort which for victims groups has been understandably unacceptable. As noted in historian Philip Seaton's text, Japan's Contested War Memories, the Asia-Pacific War remains a current affairs issue, which breaks along conservative and progressive lines, but is often obscured in foreign press coverage by focusing on the perspective of the state and not the majority opinion. The state-centric orthodoxy is neat, self-affirming, beneficial, morally comfortable, and has enough truth in it to stand up to moderate scrutiny. This is why the charges of Japanese ignorance, amnesia, denial, and failure to address the past can be recycled in English-language discourses with very little challenge. The problem is that the orthodoxy's survival relies on ignoring the vast majority of what the Japanese say about the war. While Moon Channel does make an effort to acknowledge the existence of progressive elements within Japan, the rhetoric and narrative of the video undercuts a lot of the nuance, like when he frames Japan as a vibrant democracy, while then elaborating about why Japan is a de facto one-party state. Ironically, by presenting this position as dominant and in so heavily leaning into the unsubstantiated claim that the Japanese animation industry is built to distribute propaganda at the direction of the Japanese state, Moon Channel promotes the very agenda he seeks to expose, and this is nowhere more exemplified than in his treatment of Otaku and Weebs, which is where we shall turn next.
Here's what I'm saying. By all means, consume anime, but be careful about becoming a weeb or an otaku.
Fundamentally, this statement, more than anything else discussed throughout, gave me the greatest degree of pause. You see, it provided me with a justification to dispense with good faith critique and simply tear into a video without redeeming qualities. If Moon Channel was simply going to dismiss the entirety of anime fandom as a lost cause, then what even was the point? Fortunately, I thought better of it. Online discourse can be incredibly toxic, and when the topic is something which people have strong opinions on, well, things can get heated. If Moon Channel's singular experience with otaku or weebs has been reactionary chuds haunting the comment sections of his videos, then it is understandable that he would emerge with a distorted sense of what otaku or weeb entails. Getting flamed has a particularly alienating effect. Understandable, but incomplete, and certainly not a point to stop at or never depart from in a video ostensibly written about the negative impact anime has had on that community. Moon Channel, and more importantly his audience, would have been better served by treating otaku and weebs in the same manner he did with 19th century Japanophiles, by researching them, instead of simply relying on personal experience. There is a vast literature relating to the study of fan communities, and anime fans occupy no small part of that literature. An excellent monograph on the topic is Susan Napier's From Impressionism to Anime, Japan as Fantasy and Fan Cult in the Mind of the West. The book follows a structure not too dissimilar to Moon Channel's own narrative, examining the representation of Japan in the mind of the West from the mid-19th century to the present day. Importantly, it includes ethnographic research Napier conducted among people who identified themselves as having constructed part of their identity around the consumption of anime, otaku, in other words. In her research, she arrives at a fundamentally different conclusion about the nature and knowledge of these fans relating to how they understand Japanese culture. Such thoughtful responses suggest that anime can give a richer picture of Japanese society than might be expected, far more than the 19th century Japanisance. The contemporary anime fans frequently seem aware of the contradictory and complex elements that make up Japanese society. Now, her views have been criticized as being a bit utopian. Susan Annett, I mentioned earlier, has said as much. But at the very least, her conclusions are predicated on years of ethnographic research, and not on her limited interactions with reactionary chuds and internet trolls. It is also problematic to assert that these reactionaries developed these views at the behest of LDP propaganda disseminated through anime. The development of political ideology is a significantly more complex process and necessarily expands beyond media consumption. As it happens, ideologically aligned political groups will support one another if it serves their own domestic needs. If anything, the idea that anime is being produced as propaganda reinforces these kinds of beliefs, as it inevitably normalizes reactionary readings of these media properties. The degree to which contemporary audiences exist in hypermediated media ecologies, which are vastly different than the conditions in the middle of the 20th century, cannot be overstated, a sentiment encapsulated by the late Mark McLelland in his introductory chapter in End of Cool Japan. New technologies not only enable the spread of these unofficial versions of Japanese media products to a wider audience, but they break the link between media content and delivery platforms. Accordingly, fans themselves have taken on active roles as mediators and distributors, and facilitated the bottom-up spread of culture across geographical and linguistic borders, in a manner that evades industry, government, and censorship board regulation. A fan base which would eventually grow large enough to propel anime into the mainstream, so much so that the Japanese state believed it could effectively use the popularity of its visual media to achieve concrete political goals, something we can now recognize as a profound mistake. As Moon Channel points out, cool is something which tends to arise organically, and so one of the fundamental obstacles to a project like Cool Japan is that the Japanese state has little control over how the country is perceived internationally. Earlier on, in the section, The Japan You Were Taught to Adore, he describes a situation where in the 1970s, during a tour of Thailand and Indonesia, then Prime Minister Kawaii Tanaka was met by massive protests of local inhabitants.
Yeah, a lot of hard feelings and still a long way to go for cultural diplomacy. Yet keep this in mind. Even as the adults protested the Prime Minister's arrival, their children were watching Japanese cartoons. The late 70s saw the introduction, for example, of anime into Thailand, where Gatchaman and Mazinger Z, known as Mikander in Thai, became popular.
As Koichi Iwabuchi points out in his article, Pop Culture Diplomacy in Japan, in South Korea and China, many of those who are happy to consume Japanese media culture actually consider historical issues separately and critically. In field research conducted in Beijing in October of 2005, I observed that young people in China could simultaneously maintain that I really like Japanese animation, it is my favorite, and I am very concerned with what happened between Japan and my country in the past. The idea that the consumption of Japanese media necessarily leads to the inculcation of consumers into developing positive feelings toward Japan, which can then be leveraged for political purposes, is incredibly naive, belying the complex nature of transcultural exchange and flows. The spread of Japanese media culture in East and Southeast Asia and multilateral intra-Asia media cultural flows in the last 2 decades have engendered unprecedented cross-border connections among people in the region. However, there is no guarantee that this understanding will evolve beyond the individualized pleasure of media consumption. Indifference, othering, and antagonism might also be generated by the spread of Japanese media culture. I mentioned it before, but the dire rhetoric Moon Channel employs to add gravitas to the video operates on the same assumptions upon which the LDP has fostered and promulgated the Cool Japan policy.
It's not about, and arguably it has never been primarily about, selling anime, selling video games, selling manga. It has always been about selling culture and about using cultural products to win not wallets, but hearts and minds.
Iwabuchi once again. As pointed out, the standard Japanese state idea of Pop culture diplomacy tends to rely on naive assumptions about media culture's capacity to improve Japan's reputation abroad and to transcend the problematic and historically constituted relations between Japan and other Asian countries. Moon Channel has become so concerned with the perceived soft power aims of the Japanese state, characterized by sinister messages hiding just beneath the surface of your favorite series, that he has uncritically accepted and promoted the very rhetoric of the LDP itself. If I can distill my criticism of this video into a single argument, it is this. Moon Channel, through lack of information and limited sources, obfuscates the more complex developmental history of Japanese animation and contemporary production models in service of his narrative. In doing so, he presents an incredibly shallow analysis of the transcultural flows and organic nature of the growth of transnational anime fandom exemplified by Otaku and Weebs. However, his underlying message that fan communities and individual fans themselves should consume media critically is something I'm fully in support of. It's the basis for why I make videos to begin with. Yet, as I hope I've been able to demonstrate, my identity as an otaku or weeb has not precluded my ability to engage critically with anime. If anything, it has been a font for wanting to develop a deeper understanding, and as the existence of Anitube can attest, I am not alone in this. The reason that responding to this video was necessary, then, is because of the reach and impact a platform like Anitube and YouTube more broadly has. As of the writing of this script, Moon Channel's video has over 350,000 views, several thousand likes and comments which are mostly supportive. While in terms of broader impact of YouTube, this is a considerably small number, in terms of Anitube, these are very good numbers. Numbers I doubt my own video could even hope to reach. But that's not really the point. Anitube Digest is a semi-weekly video digest of content produced by creators whose channels have centered their content on anime and manga, which has been produced by Weebs, aka Caribou-kun, for the last 5 years. The digest has acted as a loose communal hub for those creators and has been fundamental in fostering any sense of community. Weebs recently announced that Digest will be coming to an end in 2024. And what this means for Anitube is difficult to say. As vehemently as I disagree with Moon Channel's thesis and argument, I nevertheless recognize that he did provide sources and a compelling narrative based on those sources. While his perspective is indubitably shaped by his personal experiences, I do not believe he ever demonstrated he was acting in bad faith. The mistakes in this video I attribute to a combination of lack of engagement with relevant scholarship, over-reliance on individual sources, careless reading, and a desire to weave a compelling narrative. If Anitube is to continue in any sort of coherent way, then what I hope you have gotten out of this video is fairly straightforward. Content creators, even amateurs like me, have a certain responsibility to our audiences. If Anitube is going to continue to be a resource where people get information about anime, then we owe it to that audience to do better. There needs to be a recalibration between engaging content and substantive critique. There needs to be a basic level of scholastic transparency, and this means there needs to be a more concerted effort among content creators to make the claims in their videos easy to trace to the source of information that claim is based on. Being an amateur is no longer an acceptable excuse for poor scholarship and lack of citations. Anitube has the potential to continue on as a discourse community, where conversations can be had and discussions fostered and made accessible to a wide and hungry audience, but ultimately, it's up to us. I think we can do it. Thanks for your time.